Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program, The Voices of Descendants, the Continued Impact of the Holocaust. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. Now in its 25th year, the museum is committed to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope you'll visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust: What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors: Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Martin Scholler. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email, membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Emanuel Rosen, Noah Lederman, and Irit Felsen. Irit Felsen, PhD, is a clinical psychologist specializing in the effects of trauma and traumatic loss and the intergenerational transmission of both trauma and resiliencies in families of Holocaust survivors. Dr. Felsen is an adjunct professor at Columbia University and at Yeshiva University in New York City, co-chair of the Trauma Working Group in the NGO on Mental Health in the United Nations, and chair of the Older Adults Work Group in the Interdivision APA COVID-19 Task Force. She maintains a private practice in Englewood, New Jersey, and her research papers and book chapters have been published in peer-reviewed publications. In addition, Dr. Felsen's art, which you can see in the image for this program, has been featured in art exhibitions in Hamburg, London, and New Jersey. Emanuel Rosen was born in 1953 in Tel Aviv. After a career as an award-winning copywriter in Israel and after graduating with an MBA from the University of San Francisco, he joined Nile Software in Berkeley, California, where he served as vice president of marketing for 10 years. His first book, The Anatomy of Buzz, was a national bestseller and was translated into 12 languages. His book, Absolute Value, co-authored with Stanford professor Itamar Simonson, won the 2016 American Marketing Association Best Book Award, and his book, If Anyone Calls, Tell Them I Died, is his fourth book and is now available in English, German, and Hebrew. Noah Lederman is the author of the memoir, A World Erased, A Grandson's Search for His Family's Holocaust Secrets. The Philadelphia Inquirer selected the memoir as one of the best books of the year, and Booklist called A World Erased a vital contribution to the Holocaust collections. His writing has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Globe, the Washington Post, Outside Magazine, Slate, and elsewhere. He is currently working on a book about his great uncle who fought in the Spanish Civil War as a member of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. So thank you to everyone who joined us today. And now I'm going to hand things over to Irit.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Sydney, for the introduction. Thank you, Noah and Emanuel, for joining us today. My choice of your two books, which are both excellent books, is obviously a reflection of something that is a little bit contested and a little bit interesting, I thought. You both are third generation. Noah, sorry, Noah, you know, I cannot get away from my Israeli accent in which it sounds like Noah and not Noah. So I apologize if it comes through as we speak. Noah's grandparents were both Holocaust survivors who survived the concentration camps in Poland. And Emanuel's grandparents left Germany when the writing was on the wall, shortly, I believe, after Kristallnacht, right, Emanuel?
Actually, 1933.
1933. And so we have here two grandsons of different types of people affected by the Holocaust and by the persecution, by the Nazi persecution. with Emanuel's grandparents, we are looking at the people who had the possibility and the understanding and the guts, the courage and everything else that it took to see the writing on the wall and to leave. And in many ways, those people for many years were not necessarily included in the definition of who were Holocaust survivors. And so when I said that my choice was one of a somewhat loaded nature, it's because this type of a family story extends the narrative of the Holocaust, the larger narrative of who was impacted and how were people impacted. As your parents, Emanuel, as your grandparents were refugees, uprooted, who lost not only all of their, basically, or not all, but a lot of their material possessions, social status, and most importantly and psychologically, everything about who they used to be, which turned out to be very devastating psychologically to your grandfather in particular. So with that inclusion, we are expanding the envelope or the narrative of all of the people that were very seriously and severely, whose lives were seriously and severely impacted by Nazi persecution. And we also, as we will hear from you, Emanuel, will start with you, if you can tell us a little bit about your story. I will also then add something about how this particular story also sheds light on the fact that many important groups were excluded from the narrative of the Holocaust and its effects, such as those people who after the Holocaust developed psychotic symptoms and were considered endogenically schizophrenic. So their problem was not related, was not seen as related to the Holocaust, but to something that they must have suffered from before or would have developed anyway. And that's a group that I actually researched in 2005 in Israel. And also people who developed severe depression, like your grandfather, like Goran Rosenberg's father that we heard from in the first session of our program, like Dr. Talila Kosh Zohar's mother, and some of whom committed suicide, again, like your grandfather and like Goran Rosenberg's father. Those people were not included in the narrative and seen as people who just suffered from something that would have happened anyway. So this story brings us also to include those issues. So Emanuel, would you please tell us a little bit about the story of your grandparents?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I can tell you three very short anecdotes that maybe will illustrate. Growing up, I had nothing to do with, I didn't feel I had nothing to do with the Holocaust, or that my family had anything to do with the Holocaust. Then I remember one incident when I was a teenager, and my mom telling me about her grandmother who came from Germany to visit them or to be with them, we're not sure, in Tel Aviv in 1935. So they left Germany in 1933. She came in 1935. And she went back to Germany in 1936 and perished in the Holocaust. And I remember asking my mom, how come she went back to Nazi Germany? And I still can hear my mom saying in Hebrew, lo yad'u, lo yad'u. That is, one did not know, one did not know. So that's one incident of a connection suddenly to the Holocaust. Another vignette, now I'm an adult, my mom is driving in Tel Aviv, I'm sitting next to her, and we're talking about her parents. We stop at a stoplight, and suddenly, out of nowhere, my mom starts crying very loudly and hitting the steering wheel and shouting those damn guilty feelings, I was shocked. The light turns green. She drives like nothing happened. She stops crying, driving, and I'm, Ima, what was it? Let's talk about it. Do you want to talk about it? After we arrived where we arrived, I tried to, she refused to go back to the subject. So that's just to give you a feel of the way I grew up in terms of the Holocaust. The third vignette, again, we're in a car. This time I'm driving. My mom, we lived in Berkeley or near Berkeley, California at the time. Now I'm 38 or maybe even 40. And we're driving from a visit in the city in San Francisco towards Berkeley, getting off the Bay Bridge. And my mom and I are talking about health and hereditary diseases, etc. And suddenly it occurs to me that I don't know how her father died. I said, actually, how did Opa die? Opa is the grandfather in German. And she says, kind of, he committed suicide. You didn't know? No, I didn't know. Nobody ever told me. And she says, this is not a conversation for the car. End of story. You know, that's also. Well, that evening we sat by the kitchen table after the kids went to sleep, and she told me the story. I already knew that my grandfather was a lawyer in Germany until 1933. 1933, he could no longer appear in court, so he was initially a theoretical Zionist. So, but that helped him make the decision with my grandma to move to Tel Aviv. He started a business in Tel Aviv. The business failed. And 23 years after that, that is in 1956, he and my grandma went back to Germany for 2 months. Upon their return, this is when he jumped for his death. He committed suicide. Now, after my mom died in 1992, I found a bunch of letters that it took me a while to realize that these were the letters that they sent from that trip to my mom, describing the trip. And I was hoping maybe that will explain why he did it. So I found a translator and we worked on this. When we finished translating the letters, I was left with lots of details, but I still didn't understand why he did it. So I decided to recreate the trip and actually followed there to, you know, stayed in the same hotels, took the same trains, stayed in the same, you know, drank coffee in the same coffee places, etc. And then in the city of Hamm, Westphalia, this is where my grandfather practiced law before the war. I was handed a folder that opened my eyes to a different part of the story. And then it turns out that my mother initiated a lawsuit against Germany to prove that those who expelled him from his profession, from his homeland, were essentially responsible for his death. So this is, in a nutshell, the story of me following their story, me taking a trip, following their trip, and about the lawsuit that took more than 7 years.
Thank you, Emanuel. And it is indeed a remarkable read. And the vignettes and the little vignette titles that you give are just precious, just incredible, so poignant and so pointed. Noah, you also went in search of the history of your grandparents, especially your grandfather initially. What can you choose to tell us about your journey? How much did you know growing up? You also didn't know much until after your grandfather passed away, where you started prying for information. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey?
Yeah, so I basically knew the Wikipedia highlights of their lives, if you will. You know, I knew my grandparents had both been in Auschwitz. I knew that they were both part of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, but I didn't really know what, their involvement was in that. I didn't know all the other camps they had been to, which between the two of them totaled 8 different camps. And I was always just prying. So like one of the few details that I knew about my grandfather, who I called Poppy, was that he was one of the sewer rats, right? The boys who could blend in a little bit better than the rest to leave the ghetto through the sewers, typically. And because he had blue eyes and I guess lightish hair, he was smuggling in potatoes and arms and whatever else. I mean, I didn't get the specifics, but I knew that's what they did. And then if I asked them any questions about it, it was always not now, don't ask, things like that. And then at the same time, there was this photograph on my grandmother's wall of her entire family, her parents, her 2 brothers, uncles, aunts, cousins, maybe about 3 dozen people. And I think some people were even cut out because they couldn't fit into the frame. And I would ask about who these people were, and the answer was that they were all murdered, which she never specifically said, just that they were dead. But these were sort of in my face as a child, and that was it. And I'd ask questions, and then by the time I was 18, my grandfather died, and my grandmother really fell into this Great Depression, and cried all the time. Anytime I visited with her, it wasn't like 10 minutes of crying and then we'd talk. It was hour and a half straight of crying and depression. And then, we could only take so much and bid farewell. And the same thing would repeat the next time we'd visit. And, I figured, well, that's really it. One of my grandparents is dead and the other one is trying to die. And the stories are gone. And, I wound up traveling after college and really close to Poland, where both my grandparents were from. And I'd reached out to my father just to let him know, and just to say, by the way, like, do you have any information for me about where they had lived? And he'd always said that he knew nothing, because I think he was very traumatized by his parents' stories, who they raised him on this because they knew no better as parents. They were in their 20s. They had no parents to guide them through raising a child. And lo and behold, they just told their daughter and son, my dad, stories about surviving the camps, which is not probably the healthiest thing for young children to hear. And so in any case, when I'm in somewhere in Eastern Europe, I get this response back from my father with a street name, and it's my grandfather's street and the town that he's from. And, I kind of at first said to myself, I'll never go to Poland. And I kind of changed that one rule because I had this information, and went to his town, and, with their town, they both grew up there, and tried to find what I could. And that kind of began the journey that brought me back home, where my grandmother was still sitting at the table crying. And, I wasn't going to bring up Poland to her because I figured it would just make her more upset. And I just told her that I went to Otwoks, which is her town. And instead of getting sad and telling me to not bring that up, her eyes lit up and she smiled for the first time. And I guess at that point it had been quite a number of years. And she just leaned forward and wanted to know more. And that began the dialogue between the two of us.
You already touched upon the difference that we see as clinicians, I see, and as researchers between the second generation and the third. So you said, your father and his sister were kind of traumatized by the stories, and it's maybe not only just the stories, it's explicit and implicit things that come up in daily life, in the family, in the life of the family, especially as children were growing up and their parents were just a few years post-liberation. I mean, I saw in the book pictures of your grandparents in Bergen-Belsen with their firstborn, right? Very early after the end of their trauma.
Right.
So, you know, the second generation author, Rosenbaum, wrote an essay titled very beautifully, I think, Secondhand Smoke, about the relationship of the second generation to their parental trauma, right? They inhaled it. It was secondhand smoke. For the third generation, it's very different. And we see more the search for missing information, for holes that are very potent, that are very much present. Like you said, the picture was in your face, but no answers, and no fragments and no stories and no little bits and pieces that the second generation did get. And that's a very big difference. Yeah. A lot of differences. Mm-hmm. Can you say something about the different way? I mean, you say in the book that your father a few times said, I don't remember. I tried not to remember, in fact.
Yeah, so for him, I think he was affected differently than my aunt. I don't know, there's many variables as to why that is. I mean, she was born in Germany, he was born in America. She was the firstborn, he was secondborn. So I'm not going to try to figure all that out. But basically, he knew nothing. He knew nothing about his parents. It was all buried very deep. And then as he read the book, he was sort of reminded of everything that he had sort of tucked into the subconscious. So I think that was interesting, and also it seemed to be cathartic for him to be able to read the facts about his parents for the second time, but feel like it was the first time. And I guess that was at that point, that was all he had left of his parents, because a lot of the memories you know, that he'd buried were no longer accessible from them, because they were both gone. So I think you know, time and the age that he was to reapproach these things all played into that and mattered.
Yeah. Emanuel, by the time you started your journey, there were not that many relatives left to interview. Some of them were very old. And what was that like for you?
Yeah, my mom, who could have told me everything, she wasn't there anymore. But there was a cousin, two cousins of hers, and her brother was still alive. So I went and interviewed them, and they gave me a lot of information. Then I wrote this book, actually in Hebrew initially, back in 2003, and sent it to them for, you know, fact checking, etc. And the more I think about it, it was probably also for their approval, because I had some hesitations about this, and I think some people in the previous sessions talked about, you know, who am I to write about, definitely about the Holocaust, but about the family and privacy issues. And I'm still not sure how my mom would react if she ever read this book. But they actually were very positive about it. They said, yeah, you have to tell this story. And they also corrected things, which I'm glad. But then for some reason, it took me another 10 years to get back to this project. I put it on the back burner, partially because, other things, I had other projects, but also part of me said, I was 50 at the time, and my grandfather committed suicide when he was 66. And I said to myself something like, maybe you need to be his age to better understand it. And I don't fully understand it, but maybe. Anyway, I waited until I got to his age, and then I got back to this project. And it's interesting because when I got back to the project, the initial book was really about them. I was not involved at all. I described their trip. And now, 10 years later, I got to it and described my trip following their trip, which was very different and very, satisfying for me. I think it helped me process many things. But now nobody from that generation is no longer in family. One of them just passed away at the beginning of this year, and she still read the English version and she liked it, and that was very good to hear from her. I will detach from that. Yeah.
It's a very, very interesting choice that you made there. Not only to sit on the book, which was already very close, the first draft was close to being complete and ready for publication, but you decided somehow to sit on it for various reasons. And then what is so interesting is the change of perspective that allowed you all of a sudden to actually change it to being your story with their story, not just their story being told by a reporter. And that I find is very, very interesting. I think it happens, you and I are close in age, and I'm second generation and you're third generation because of the very young age that your mother was when her parents left Germany. But what we see in our cohort of second generation is that after the parents pass away, and somehow as part of our own journey through our life and aging, we come to this point, and a lot of people are beginning to acknowledge that this is their story, whereas before it was something that maybe it was our parents' story, maybe it was not my story at all. There's a certain different willingness to look at our story with their story. Noah, you belong really generationally and also age-wise very much to the cohort of the third generation of children of survivors who survived the Holocaust in Europe. In that way, you have less of a journey through your own life yet, but do you feel a difference in terms of how you looked at things before you wrote the story and after, and what made you change the perspective to it being your story, which I'll get back and ask you too, Emanuel. How did that shift happen for you?
I think the reason that it became my story intertwined with my grandparents' story was because, I actually started writing it as these like paired biographies of, my grandparents, trying to remove myself from that. But, there's many memoirs by Holocaust survivors, and my book just started to kind of sound like very removed. And I sort of thought that trying to access these stories was part of my story, right? Like the struggle, the journey to get there, the conversations with my grandma were both, sad and hilarious. And I thought, like there's a lot of books that are about the Holocaust that are just sad. And I thought the remove that I had from it, being a third generation, allowed for more moments of humor, allowed for, this point that I was trying to make, that these stories didn't come easy. And looking forward, they're obviously going to be much harder to collect and to hear, because we're so removed. My children, they never met my grandparents, but they're very curious about them. And there's only so much I could say to them at this point. One is 7, one is 9. The 9-year-old, she wants to read my book, which is probably a first for a parent who's an author. I hear that doesn't happen that often. And I obviously tell her it's not appropriate for you yet, but she has read Number of the Stars and shows a real interest, which is great. And I try to encourage that. But I don't think that's very common. And I think as we get more removed generation wise from the Holocaust, it's just going to be a greater struggle to keep these stories alive, and we have to figure out ways to do that.
Yeah, Emanuel, can I, before I go there, Emanuel, can you tell me, how did that shift happen for you?
Like in the case, what Noah just said, I think I part of me wanted to share how difficult the journey was, but it was mostly, I was very reluctant to involve myself, and it was readers who pulled me in, both, a cousin who made a comment, where are you in the story? Or my wife who said, okay, tell us how you felt. And I was very reluctant to do that. But once I started, I saw that it's good for me, and it's definitely good for the book, because as Noah said, there are so many books about the Holocaust at a distance, which are also great, but I really felt that I want to tell it as my story.
I think I cannot agree more with both of you. I think that the books are, when Holocaust survivors wrote their stories, those memoirs were incredibly meaningful. Some of the books that were written by other people who had a direct connection with Holocaust survivors were also very good as reporting about. At this point, from us, from the Descendants, I think we have to tell our story, which is part, again, of the bigger picture of what it means to grow up in a family where there are small secrets, as you called them, Emanuel, like the little jokes within the family, like Darfish, yes, and other big stories, and big secrets, like Grandpa committed suicide, or in your case, Noah, there's a picture on the wall, which, by the way, did you ever ask how that picture survived?
Yes, and I believe I'm telling it correctly now. It's been many years since the story, since the book came out, or enough years where I can't remember everything completely accurately. But I think it was sent to a family member either in Israel or New York. Right. Because my grandmother's grandfather was in Israel at the time of the war, and he was very connected with the Ger Rebbe, so yeah, it was sent to a relative somewhere.
Yeah, that's exactly the same way that the only picture that I have from my father's family survived. It was sent to one sister who has already left Poland. Right. They all dressed up nicely and got a picture to send to her, and that's the one picture I have. And so I was saying, I think that it's so important to tell our story, the descendant story of what it means like to grow up in a family where there are such omnipresent holes, like a picture on the wall that no one can talk about, and suicide that nobody can talk about, and all of these people that lived before and who they were, and how are we maybe like them, and what was the life that they lived before the destruction of the Holocaust, not to mention the horrific events that led to the immigration, the forced immigration, the Holocaust atrocities that people lived through, and that explains so much of what we live with, but we don't have the story for if it's not told. What does that legacy of intergenerational transmission teach us and mean is very important to communicate, and that's what you did with your books. I wanted to also ask you, Sydney, if you just will pipe in. I think it is now, we have 10 more minutes of our discussion before we open for Q&A?
Yes.
10 more minutes?
Yeah, 10 minutes.
Okay. So I wanted to point out the fact that you said that in your discussions with your grandma, whom you really hilariously described on occasion there, Noah, and you did too, Emanuel, actually. So both of you show something that we see when we look as researchers in phenomena that are different between the second generation and the third. We see that in the third generation, the perception of the grandparents and the perception of the relationship is different. It's a lot of the difficulty, a lot of the anger, a lot of the stuff that made for complex relationships between some second generation and their survivor parents is no longer there. And instead, there is a much more a warmer relationship, and the stories of victimization and of humiliation are much less part of what this third generation has in mind or shares. A lot more the focus is on the fortitude, on the resilience of the of the grandparents, on their ability to endure what they endured. And in your case, Emanuel, of course, what ended up happening was a very tragic end to the story of your grandfather, but you also very vividly communicate the fortitude and the vivacious, life-loving nature of your grandmother and your mother, who herself lost her husband tragically at such an early age. Can you say something about that?
Well,
about grandma?
About yeah, I mean, my grandmother was the happiest person that I knew, at least from the outside. And she, I think this trip did something interesting to her versus to my grandfather. But for my grandfather, he was longing for Germany, his homeland, you know, and his profession and everything. And during this trip, he realized that he no longer belonged there. He came back to Israel that he never connect to, so he was left in midair, you know, as I write in the book, nishtahin, nishtaher, you know, in Yiddish, it was really, and that's, I think, what contributed to his tragic end. For my grandmother, I think on this trip, actually her Israeli identity was reinforced, and she even started writing things in Hebrew. I mean, like many Yekes, she didn't speak, or some Yekes, she didn't speak any Hebrew, but she really felt an Israeli. And she realized that her mission in life now, coming back, and after my mom was left with 2 kids at age 31 to raise them by herself, my sister and I, and my grandmother took it on to help her, and she was just a happy person, and she was really a wonderful person. And she was different from my mom, who was more, I mean, my mom had a lot on her shoulders, including her mom and her aunt and all her clients at the office. She worked with survivors on restitution issues all of her life for over 30 years. So she had a lot on her shoulders. My grandmother was a grandmother. Like now I'm a grandfather. I know what there are some privileges in being a grandfather. You get the luxury of seeing your grandkids only at good times, etc. So yeah, she was just a very funny lady, and but we never talked about any negative things. And I would ask her for stories from früher, from the past, and she would tell from before, and she would tell me everything was very rosy, and yeah.
Yeah. I think the difference between your grandmother and your grandfather, and the difference between your grandfather and grandmother, Noah, are such telling differences about how different people were in their response to these incredible traumatic events and incredibly traumatic losses that they suffered. And you too, Noah, in your relationship with your grandfather, describe such a warm and such an enjoyable sense of being together with him, right?
Yeah, I mean, he was always, someone that I looked up to. I saw him as this hero figure. Of course, knowing the details that I knew, like a guy who was in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, I mean, already that's a good credential to have as a potential hero. So yeah, I just looked up to him. He was fun. He would take me out he lived in Brighton Beach, and we'd go out for walks on the boardwalk, and he'd give me coins to play in the arcade. So it was great.
Even his gold watch, if you just said that it's interesting.
Right. Yeah. If I just commented on a piece of jewelry that he had, which I'm not interested in jewelry, he would just say, "Here, it's yours," and try to give it to me. So he was just a kind guy, someone who never had anything, who came from nothing. He was always trying to give me everything. And I guess, that spoke to who he was.
So, that brings me at the unfortunate end of our discussion, because I would love to continue with you guys for much longer, to another issue, which is that I think we are dealing now with how to shape the memory of the Holocaust for future generations that, like you said about your children, Noah, generations who will never have seen a survivor, who have never have had the opportunity to meet a survivor. And there are changes in the way that this is being thought about. You say your grandfather was, one of the sewer rats, and later the uprising. So one of those very heroic figures. I think we see also, Emanuel, you said something in your book about recognizing in retrospect how your grandfather saved your family by being one of those few who read the writing on the wall early enough and had the courage to make such a terrible move at this point in life as a middle-aged established attorney. And then everything in the middle, both of you spoke of acts of kindness in the midst of the most terrible situations. You, Noah, spoke of at least two cases that I remember where your grandmother actually saved somebody else's life by supporting them in a way that could have cost her her own life. One was Rose and one was Elizabeth, if you recall. Yes?
Yeah.
And you, Emanuel, mentioned that your great-grandmother, you were told that she gave her food when she was deported to the concentration camp she gave her food to younger people. So those acts, which a writer by the name of Shostak referred to as stealth altruism. So altruism that was done stealthily in a way that could have endangered the life of both the person that helped and the person that was being helped. These things happened a lot. Ron Appelfeld, we mentioned in the last meeting, the name of the book that the group in Israel chose was a quote from Aaron Appelfeld's interview where he said, but there was love there. There were not just atrocities. There was love between people and tremendous altruism and tremendous acts of assisting and being assisted, which are now much more recognized as part of the heroism and the endurance of the human spirit and of values that we may want to transmit, not just the horror stories, but also that. And that's my last question to both of you. What is it that you got out of writing your books and what you wish to transmit with them further? Emanuel?
Well, first of all, I agree totally with what you just said. I'll tell you a little anecdote that happened to me actually in Germany. There was a group there that was very excited about translating the book from English to German, and they took it on themselves and they started doing it. And I came out to work with them one day, and we had a meeting in the morning, and there is a little paragraph there that my uncle, Rafi, was a Mossad person. He was actually one of the head of the units to hunt down Nazi criminals. And there is a mention that he was in charge of the contact with Fritz Bauer, who was the DA, the Jewish DA in Germany, who gave Israel the information about the whereabouts of Adolf Eichmann. So I mentioned it in the book, and one of the guys who I met with said that he won't join us for lunch. He's going, but he'll join us later. He can't, he has to run some errands. Well, when he came back from lunch, he gave me a stamp that was issued apparently 2 days before, a stamp in honor of Fritz Bauer. I actually have it right here. I don't know if I can show it. That's a picture of Fritz Bauer, who was that person. And there is a quote there on the stamp. There is a quote from Fritz Bauer. And I don't read German, so I say, what does it say? And I have the translation here. It's nothing is a thing of the past. Everything is present and can become the future again.
Wow.
Nothing is a thing of the past. Everything is present and can become the future again. I think that's what I took from this.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Emanuel. Noah?
Yeah, I mean, I think that quote sort of sums up my mission as well. I mean, obviously, I wanted personally to capture my grandparents' stories. You know, they were always interesting to me, and they were part of my identity, and kind of felt like a piece was missing. So personally, that's what I wanted. But from a more, you know, a larger standpoint, you know, I want these stories to have a purpose and tell a story and teach a lesson in a way that is just accessible to a different generation. You know, I think people sometimes can't relate to history because it feels so long ago. And as we get more removed from the survivors, you know, these, you know, not many people pick up accounts from the Civil War, memoirs from the Civil War, and memoirs from the Revolutionary War. So eventually, I don't know, I hope it doesn't go the same way, but stories start to disappear as we get more removed from maybe the person telling the story. So I just maybe hope this will be like a bridge to that generation.
Well, thank you so much. I cannot express enough my admiration for the fact that you actually were able to go on this journey and to complete it. I myself am immersed in working with Holocaust survivors and their descendants and doing research and writing in that way, but I still have not had I don't know what it is that it takes, but I know that there's a great effort that I'm not managing to overcome to sit and write whatever fragments I know and my story as the daughter of my parents. So kol hakavod to you, and thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me today.
Thank you.
You.
I think we'll open it now to some of the questions and comments. Sydney, do we have any questions and comments from the audience?
We have a lot, so I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. I think the first one I want to start with, and I think this also kind of refers to past events that we've had in this series. The speakers in our last event in the series were all part of writing groups for the second and third generation. Did either of you, were you ever a part of a group like that? And if so, did you find it to be valuable?
I can start. I can say that I watched actually the last session about the groups, and I envied the people there. I was never part of a writing group about the Holocaust. I mean, I took writing classes over the years that, and I read some of the material, but I think it was very different than having people who had a shared experience. So, yeah, I did it totally by myself, and maybe it wasn't the right thing.
Similar, I was part of writing groups that, the writers wrote on various topics, met in a random cafe or bar, but not other writers who were writing on the same topic.
Sydney, can I insert a question that I can't wait to ask, which is when did you make the time to actually sit and write?
things are easier before kids come along.
That's right. Emanuel, you can't say the same.
Yeah, I'm fortunate that I was able, I was part of a startup that we sold in 1999, and I have a wonderful wife who helps me and pushes me. So that's what I do. That is my fourth book, and now, so I get up in the morning and I write, and I love doing that.
Wonderful, wonderful. Yes, Sydney.
So, Irit, you kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, and I'm going to combine several questions here, but people are asking, how you felt writing your grandparents' story. And, some people have said, like, it's hard for me to feel like that is something that's okay for me to do. Did you ever encounter that feeling, and how did you how did you deal with that?
Well, I spoke to my grandmother, and she knew what we were doing. Like, this was a process that took about 6 years. And I also, at the end, got to read her about the first 100 pages of the book, until she thought that the mouse on the screen was a fly and cracked the screen with her hand. But yeah, I mean, she was very excited that somebody was telling her story. Obviously, I don't know how my grandfather, Poppy, would have felt because he was long gone, but this was their stories as told from my perspective. So, when there are the facts, it's noted as such, and these facts come from interviews that they had done with the Shoah Foundation, piecing together things based on what I knew of their timeline from other historical records, items that I'd found in the Holocaust archives and such. And then, of course, my grandmother's testimony over those 6 years. And then when there's things that, I wasn't sure if it was, me reading into it, I think I made that clear in the book, in a few moments where I was, saying that this is what I think happened in a couple of events, just because I didn't want to misinterpret what their actual experiences were.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a lot of hesitations, and I still, especially when it comes to talking about my grandfather, whom I didn't know, but talking about this, I'm not 100% comfortable with everything that I said, but like Noah, I was very specific about talking, when I'm imagining something, I say that facts are very important to me, and there are extensive footnotes at the end that explain where I got the information from. But yeah, it's not an easy decision, but I think that, as I said earlier, I got the encouragement from that generation, those who were still alive, and people who told me that, including people in Germany, by the way, who told me, yeah, you have to tell this story. Your mom would have loved it if you told this story, people who knew her from Germany. But it is a dilemma.
It is really a dilemma. I hear it from so many people who say to me, even people who start, and then, as I mentioned in a previous segment, and another sibling says, no, it's not okay. You can't disclose mom's privacy in such a way, she's no longer here. She can't, it's a dilemma. But then on the other hand, it is also our story. Sydney, is
So
there?
Yeah, we have time, I think, for one more question,
Okay.
which I'm going to kind of generalize because we've gotten a few very specific questions. But sort of what advice do you have for people who want to write a similar book, and especially about doing the research for it?
I would say the first advice, is to read a lot, write a lot, and erase a lot. I think that's usually what one should do, is just start putting things on paper and or on the keyboard, and then, as far as research, it was very time consuming to do all the research. But I have to say that these days, there are online online archives that are just unbelievable in terms of their breadth, and so those were very helpful. And going there, I think, is important, because being at the places where things happen, your mind starts working on the book, if you want it or not, and you start imagining how they were.
Yeah, I think that pretty much encompasses that, and what I had said before about finding pieces of fact and doing the deeper dives on each of those items. So if the grandparent was in a specific concentration camp, there's tons of books and records on what those places were like, and you could really use the history to reconstruct some of that. The archives at various museums. I don't know, this was years ago when I did this, but the Red Cross was a valuable archive where they sent me many documents. So I think if you have names, it's a really strong starting point to dig deep into this. There's a lot out there.
So I just wanted to end with a small comment, Emanuel, about the missing pieces that we feel as second and third generation. Like you, I spent some time in Germany. I worked for the Israeli government there, and many of the feelings that you describe in the book are very similar to how I felt. But what I want to say is, it was shocking to, as an Israeli, to come there and all of a sudden see everybody else do things that only my parents did, and that were so foreign and weird in Israel. But then here everybody was doing it, and it was the norm. And it gave me such a shocking sense of how different the lives that our parents had to build and your grandparents had to build in the different countries that they went to, and what does it feel like to come back into that world for a minute and see what it was like for them before.
Yeah.
So I have to thank you again from the depth of my heart. And thank you, Sydney, for everything, making this possible. And hope to stay in touch.
Yeah, I want to thank, oh, sorry, go ahead, Emanuel.
No, just thank you very much. Yeah.
Same. Thank you.
Yeah, I want to thank all three of you as well. And Irit, I especially want to say thank you for putting together this series. It's really been wonderful to work on this with you.